You stand at the banks of the Nile River, the gentle breeze brushing against your skin, filling the air with the earthy scent of mud and moisture. In the distance, the golden sunlight bathes the vast desert and fields, and the river flows quietly, reflecting the calmness of the scene. Ancient Egypt, this land of ancient grandeur and mysteries, was a cradle of civilization. However, despite its cultural brilliance and rich mythology, the life of a woman here was far from liberating. On this land, a woman's fate was already etched in the heavy stones of history, seemingly unchangeable. Their existence was often confined to the roles of mother and wife, their voices and desires routinely ignored and suppressed. As you move through the ancient city, every magnificent palace, every intricately carved stone tablet tells the story of this civilization's greatness. Yet, nowhere is there a page dedicated to the lives of women in this society. Your gaze rests on a woman sitting by the river, weaving fabric with quiet focus. Her expression is serious, as if her entire world is contained in the loom in front of her. Yet there's something in her eyes, a quiet sadness, an unspoken resignation. In her eyes, you see no trace of freedom, only the burden of the daily grind, as she fulfills the duties expected of her as a wife and mother. In ancient Egypt, women's marriages were almost always arranged. They had little say in choosing their husbands, marriage was a destiny set by their fathers. Whether they liked it or not, whether their hearts desired freedom or not, the chains of marriage bound them tightly. Being a wife and mother meant more than just responsibility, it meant the loss of personal freedom. A woman's life here rarely allowed for choice. Her fate lay in the hands of her father, husband, and even the gods. In ancient Egypt, women's access to education was limited. Though some noblewomen might receive some education, the majority of women were excluded from scholarly pursuits. The realms of culture and academia were predominantly reserved for men. Women who did manage to carve out a place in history, such as powerful queens or high priestesses, were few and far between. Their very existence was a challenge to the norms and rules of the time, but even they could not escape the societal expectations placed on women. Women could not own property, nor could they be financially independent. Even in the household, their role was secondary to men. Women had no right to inherit property and no say in family affairs. Their value was measured by their relationship to the men in their lives, their role as wives, mothers, and daughters, not as individuals. Their existence seemed to be only to support the men in their lives, until their bodies no longer could bear children, and the burdens of housework left them exhausted and frail. Only then did their lives begin to fade. Despite this, ancient Egyptian society had a certain reverence for women. Powerful and mystical goddesses, like Hathor and Isis, were revered and worshipped. These mythological female deities symbolized love, motherhood, strength, and wisdom. However, this reverence for women in mythology rarely translated into the reality of women's lives. The female gods in the myths held immense power, yet the real women of Egypt could only dream of such authority. Perhaps the reverence for female deities was merely a symbolic comfort, offering women a glimpse of an ideal they could never touch. As you walk through the streets, you see women hurrying by, carrying water pots, holding baskets. Their steps are heavy, and their faces often wear no expression. The hardships of their lives are written on every weary face. They have no time for their own dreams, each day is consumed by their duties, and their desires have long been buried under the weight of life's demands. Their lives exist solely to meet the needs of their husbands, fathers, and children, with little regard for their own wishes. In ancient Egypt, a woman's beauty was often given great value. Young and beautiful women might receive special attention from their husbands or fathers, and their beauty would become part of the family and society's assets. However, as they aged, women's status often declined. With the fading of their beauty, their worth seemed to diminish as well. Society had strict standards for women's appearance, but beneath these standards lay a devaluation of their intrinsic worth. Within the home, women's roles were often silent. They were wives, mothers, and caretakers, but their voices were rarely heard. No matter how much effort they put into their duties, their contributions were often taken for granted. Even when they gave their all, their efforts were seldom recognized or respected. Their lives lacked their own stories, only endless silent service to the needs of others. Yet, despite the oppressive and limiting conditions faced by women in ancient Egypt, they continued to live and endure. In the long course of history, many women left their mark through their resilience and courage. Though they couldn't change the world, every small victory they fought for, every inch of freedom and dignity they claimed, laid the foundation for the struggles of the women who came after them. You stand silently at the river's edge, gazing at the setting sun. The waters of the Nile continue to flow peacefully, as if telling the eternal story of this land. And you know that on this soil, the women of the past lived lives just like these waters, unceasing, quietly bearing the weight of the generations. The golden sunlight filters through the ancient desert, warming your shoulders, while a gentle breeze brushes across this timeless land. You stand at the heart of ancient Egypt, your gaze drawn to the towering temples and stone carvings. The crowds rush by, but your eyes remain focused on the women moving swiftly through the streets. Dressed in simple garments, their faces show little expression, and their steps seem hurried, as if every moment is burdened by the weight of life's responsibilities. Their eyes seem to hold no trace of choice, only the fate that has been arranged for them, the duty of home and family. In ancient Egypt, marriage was an inevitable fate that every woman had to face. From the moment a woman was born, her role was predetermined: to marry, bear children, and take care of the household. For many women, marriage was not a choice but a responsibility and obligation set by society. Young women were told from an early age that marriage was their most important task, and the choice of who they would marry was rarely up to them. Marriage here was arranged by the father. Before a woman even understood the concept of love, her parents had already chosen her future husband. This man might be someone she had met only a few times, or perhaps a stranger from a distant land. In many families, there was little discussion about marriage. It was simply a matter of fulfilling one's societal role. Women's responsibility was to marry, care for their husbands, and manage the household, even if their hearts longed for more, for freedom, for choice, for something other than what was already set in stone. Marriage in ancient Egypt was like a fate bound by invisible threads, tight and inescapable. Women weren't allowed to choose love, they were hardly permitted to decide their own lives. Marriage here was not about personal happiness but about maintaining the continuity of the family and the stability of society. A woman's marriage wasn't just the union of two people, but a fulfillment of her family's and society's expectations. Her father would determine the match based on family ties and social alliances, not based on her own desires. These women were taught from the beginning that their worth was often defined by their marriages. Before they entered into one, their value was dictated by their fathers, and once they were married, their identity would shift, subsumed under their husbands' names. Her place in the family was judged by her loyalty and dedication to her husband and children. If her husband was wealthy, she could enjoy a more comfortable life. If he was poor or cruel, she was left to suffer in silence. In the majority of cases, a woman's life was shaped by the men around her. Marriage meant a deep compromise of personal life. Within the marriage, a woman's individuality was rarely seen. She was no longer a person with dreams and desires, but rather an extension of her husband and children. She couldn't own property, nor could she control the family's affairs. Her value was measured only by her ability to fulfill the duties of wife and mother. A woman's life in ancient Egypt was almost entirely devoted to the household, leaving little room for personal choice or fulfillment. After marriage, women had little time to pursue their own interests or careers. Their daily lives revolved around domestic chores and raising children. The world they inhabited was entirely centered on their families, and their only role was to serve it. Even if they had aspirations, they rarely had the opportunity to express or achieve them. A woman's voice was often soft and unheard in the marriage, her needs and wishes overshadowed by the demands of family life. The pressure and responsibility placed on women within marriage were immense, but they rarely received the respect or recognition they deserved. Ancient Egyptian society didn't provide women with enough resources or opportunities to display their intellect or talents. Even those few women who rose to prominence, like Queen Hatshepsut or Cleopatra, had to fight against intense opposition to overcome the societal constraints on women. The majority of Egyptian women, despite their intelligence and capability, couldn't break free from the social norms that defined their roles. As you pass by a temple, your gaze lingers on the mythological stories etched into the walls. Ancient Egyptian mythology was rich with powerful female deities: Isis, the mother and wife goddess; Hathor, the goddess of love and music. These deities symbolized strength, wisdom, and love, revered and respected by the people. Yet, the reverence for these goddesses did not extend to real women in society. In the myths, female deities held immense power, yet the real women of Egypt could only dream of wielding such authority. Perhaps the reverence for female gods was simply a symbolic comfort, offering women an ideal that they could never fully reach. You sit on an ancient stone bench, your eyes gazing out at the busy street. Women walk by, heads lowered, rushing to complete their endless tasks. Their faces reveal little emotion, more often than not showing signs of exhaustion. Their lives, it seems, are filled with duties and responsibilities, and their desires have long been buried under the weight of everyday life. Their lives exist only to fulfill the needs of their husbands, fathers, and children, with little room left for their own wishes. Marriage, in both the context of ancient Egypt and society at large, played a central role. It defined a woman's existence, her responsibilities, and her place in the patriarchal society. For most women, marriage was not a choice but a destiny, a fate they could not escape. From the start, they were not permitted to choose their future companions, and everything about their marriage was already decided for them. Their lives, it seemed, were never truly their own, only shaped by the responsibilities of family and the expectations of society. Yet, even in this land of limitations and oppression, women endured. Though they could not change the fate of their marriages, they carried the weight of their families, children, and society with silent strength. They may not have been able to alter the circumstances of their lives, but their efforts, their sacrifices, laid the groundwork for the struggles of the women who would come after them. Every woman, in her quiet resilience, wrote her own story, one of endurance, sacrifice, and strength. As night falls, the ancient Egyptian city is bathed in a soft golden glow. You walk along the broad stone streets, hearing the hum of the market and the conversations of the people. Each stone, each towering column seems to tell a story of the past, and yet, in this long river of history, the presence of women is often faint and suppressed. The social structure of ancient Egypt was deeply rooted in a patriarchal system, where the existence of women was almost entirely defined by their relationships to men. Whether in the home, society, or religion, men occupied the dominant role. Women's rights, freedoms, and opportunities were often dictated by men. Their roles were typically confined to the household and childbearing, while society's expectations of them were clear, unconditionally served these traditional roles. In ancient Egyptian family structures, the husband was the head of the household, and the wife was his dependent and assistant. Whether it was family decisions or resource distribution, the husband's opinion held ultimate authority. Women were not allowed to play an independent role in family matters, and they had little opportunity to participate in public life. Women's voices and opinions were often suppressed under the dominance of male authority, and this was true not only for women from ordinary social classes but also for noble women. Although women from higher classes in ancient Egypt seemed to enjoy certain privileges and respect, their rights were still limited. They could own some property, participate in religious ceremonies, and sometimes manage family affairs, but these rights were always granted by male family members. A woman's existence was almost always defined by her relationship with her father, husband, or brother, and women who managed to break free from male authority were exceedingly rare. Ancient Egypt's legal system further reinforced women's subordinate position within the patriarchal society. While the laws of ancient Egypt acknowledged women's rights in some areas, such as inheritance and marriage choices, these rights were not always equitably protected in practice. In matters of marriage and divorce, men usually held the power, and women were often left at a disadvantage. Whether marrying or divorcing, a woman's choices were limited, and in many cases, they could not effectively secure their rightful claims. The position of women in society did not fundamentally change over time. Women in ancient Egypt were regarded as the caretakers of the household and childbearing, and their social roles revolved around housework, raising children, and supporting their husbands. Even in religious and public life, women's roles were typically as consorts or subordinates to male gods. While female deities like Isis and Hathor were revered as powerful goddesses symbolizing motherhood and life, real women in Egyptian society did not enjoy the same power and freedom. Their status was always confined within the traditional gender roles, and they could not break free from male dominance. In ancient Egypt, women's bodies were often seen as their greatest value. From marriage to family, and to social expectations, a woman's body was intimately tied to her role. Their lives were largely defined by their ability to bear children and provide heirs to their husbands and families. Childbearing became the most important task for women, and their personal desires, dreams, and independence were often overshadowed by the pressures of social demands. Although some women in ancient Egypt gained a certain social standing through marriage or religious positions, this status was always within the patriarchal framework. For example, Queen Hatshepsut, who rose to power as one of the few female rulers of ancient Egypt, had to fight against immense opposition from male power structures. Her reign, though admirable, was not without controversy. Even her success, despite being remarkable, highlights the immense challenges faced by women in ancient Egypt who sought power, always under the approval and support of men. On this land, women's lives were rarely ones of choice. Their rights, freedoms, and social positions were all fixed within the framework of patriarchy. Even those few women who managed to rise above these restrictions, becoming rulers or high priestesses, did so under the guidance and consent of male figures. The majority of women were destined to live out their lives within the constraints of their family roles, unable to escape the shackles of a patriarchal society. Yet, despite these limitations and constraints, women in ancient Egypt found their way. Though their rights were limited and their lives lived in the shadow of men, they still managed to serve their families and society with strength and dedication. Their resilience, wisdom, and courage may not have been celebrated in history's grand narratives, but their spirit is forever embedded in the land of Egypt. Every woman, though oppressed, quietly fought against the restraints of a patriarchal society and wrote her own silent legacy. You stand before the scholar's market in ancient Egypt, the sunlight filtering through the fine bamboo curtains and spilling onto the bustling streets. The air carries the scent of parchment and a hint of dust, surrounding you with piles of papyrus scrolls and mysterious hieroglyphs. This is a place of knowledge, yet as a woman, you find yourself always kept at the edge of this world. Despite Egypt's great achievements and wisdom, you know that women here have limited access to education. In ancient Egypt, education was largely the domain of men, particularly when it came to knowledge in the fields of science, astronomy, and mathematics. While some noble women had limited opportunities to learn, the majority of women had little access to formal education. Those male scholars who understood complex texts, the stars, and the science of the heavens, were trained from childhood in the intellectual disciplines, whereas women were taught to manage households, raise children, and support their husbands. Knowledge was a luxury, something few women could afford. The educational journey for women in ancient Egypt was almost non-existent. Even the noblewomen who had some chance to learn were mainly taught domestic skills, not academic subjects. They might have been exposed to some temple education, but this education focused more on the knowledge of family and marriage than on intellectual or scholarly pursuits. Their wisdom was often measured by how well they could keep the household running, care for their children, and provide support for their husbands, but it was never about science or philosophy. You walk through a grand temple, its walls adorned with ancient texts and mythological stories, hieroglyphs that speak of astronomical phenomena, medicine, mathematics, and philosophy. You gaze at the intricately carved symbols, feeling a deep sense of longing. These texts hold the secrets of the cosmos, the mysteries of life, yet you know these mysteries are not for you. Women were never expected to participate in the scholarly world. They were rarely invited to explore the universe as men did. Women's access to knowledge remained limited to the domestic sphere, their intellectual curiosity suppressed by the demands of society. Inside the temple, priests are performing complex rituals, their richly embroidered robes swaying as they chant ancient incantations. You watch them control the stars, explaining the universe's order, a world of celestial wisdom beyond your reach. You wonder, if only you could be like them, to learn, to understand the deep mysteries of the heavens. But this knowledge, this freedom, is not for you. You are a woman, destined to live under the guidance of men, never allowed the same opportunity to seek out knowledge. In ancient Egypt, women, though often praised for their beauty and their gentle nature, were confined to the roles of household caretakers and mothers. Their knowledge was practical, limited to the management of their homes and families. The male scholars who designed astronomical models and built temples could only be men. The women of Egypt were seldom allowed to step into that intellectual space. Their wisdom was locked away in daily tasks, under the weight of their familial duties. Even those few women who gained some form of education were often forced to learn only about marriage and domestic life. They were never taught how to read astronomical charts, how to understand the natural world, or how to challenge the norms of society. The brightest women could only thrive in limited areas, never breaking free from the societal constraints that bound them. Knowledge was not a gift that every woman could claim. You sit on the steps of a temple, gazing at the papyrus scrolls in front of you. The pages are filled with the ancient hieroglyphs that speak of the universe's mysteries. A feeling of longing washes over you, a sense of loss and unfulfilled desire. If only you were a man, perhaps you too could learn, explore, and carry on these intellectual legacies. But the reality is harsh. Your path is narrow, and your dreams are often impossible to achieve. You can only rely on your father, your husband, or even your sons to fulfill your thirst for knowledge, but never experience the world of scholarship firsthand. And yet, despite all this, you do not give up. You know that you too have the ability to understand the wisdom of this land. You long to think freely, to learn, and to discover. But the societal chains of ancient Egypt bind you, and that path is not yours to walk. The only thing left is to quietly watch, to endure in silence, though your heart yearns for more. Slowly, you rise and stand before the temple, lifting your eyes to the sky. The stars above are so deep, so vast, and they seem to whisper endless stories. You close your eyes, feeling an indescribable emotion stir within you. You know that while you may never possess the knowledge that others hold, you still carry a heart that seeks the truth. And that heart, no one can take from you. You walk through the bustling market of ancient Egypt, where the air is thick with the smells of spices and food, and the sounds of merchants calling out to passers-by fill the atmosphere. The stalls are filled with items, from spices to jewelry, from textiles to food, and yet, you notice that behind the bustling life, there's an unspoken imbalance. The goods and wealth in this market seem to belong to everyone but the women. In ancient Egypt, wealth and resources were largely controlled by men. Even women from noble families had limited ability to own property independently of their husbands or fathers. While some women could inherit parts of their family's wealth, their financial activities and control over assets were often subject to male decisions. As a woman, you know you will never truly own wealth for yourself. Wealth is simply not within a woman's reach. Passing through the market, you notice a woman selling baskets. Her eyes are filled with focus and patience, but there is a faint trace of helplessness in her smile. While her goods may sell, the income is rarely hers to keep. She is an accessory to her husband or her family, unable to control her finances. Her life and efforts, in the end, always belong to the men around her. This is not just a phenomenon in the marketplace. Women's property rights in ancient Egypt were always subordinate. Within the household, the husband was the manager of the family's wealth, while the wife was the spender rather than the owner. Even if some women were allowed to own small amounts of property, their ability to manage or control their wealth was still constrained by the men in their lives. A woman's income, inheritance, and even the wealth she accumulated through marriage were ultimately controlled by men. The legal system in ancient Egypt further reinforced women's subordinate position in economic matters. While the law acknowledged women's rights to inherit property and make some financial decisions, these rights were rarely implemented equally. In matters of marriage and divorce, men held the power, and women were often left at a disadvantage. Women's choices were severely limited when it came to property and wealth, and in many cases, they could not effectively protect or claim what was rightfully theirs. Even when women were able to acquire resources, their use of wealth and resources was constrained by social roles and family duties. Women's lives were almost entirely focused on managing households, raising children, and supporting their husbands. They had no freedom to invest or create wealth, and their financial decisions were often made by men. In ancient Egypt, wealth was a resource controlled by men and not a commodity women could wield. This lack of economic independence meant that women in ancient Egypt could never truly achieve financial freedom. Their economic position was entirely dependent on their husbands or fathers, and even if they had the ability to generate or manage wealth, they lacked the opportunity to do so. In this patriarchal society, women had almost no participation in economic activity and were confined to roles that centered around domestic duties and familial support. Yet, despite all these limitations, some women still played crucial roles in the family economy. They managed household chores, raised children, and contributed to agricultural or family business activities. While they couldn't be financially independent, they were indispensable to the functioning of the family and society. Their contributions, though rarely acknowledged, were vital to the family's survival and the stability of society. You sit in a quiet corner of the market, watching the busy women pass by. Each one of them contributes tirelessly to their families and to society but is never able to claim the wealth or power they generate. Their wealth is controlled by fathers, husbands, sons, and societal expectations, and they are never given the autonomy to manage their own finances. Their labor, intelligence, and efforts are often taken for granted, rather than being rewarded. However, even within this framework, women still seek ways to assert themselves and find independence. While they cannot fully control their wealth, they still contribute greatly to their families, children, and society. Their wisdom and strength may be suppressed in the daily duties of the household, but their impact on the family and society is undeniable. Even though their names may not be remembered by history, they have nonetheless left an indelible mark on this civilization. You lift your gaze to the golden sunset in the distance, the Nile River sparkling in the light, as if telling the stories of millennia. You know that, despite the many women who have quietly contributed to the land, their wealth and power have always been controlled by men. Yet their resilience and wisdom have left deep imprints on this ancient land. The sun's rays pierce through the heavy desert air, casting a golden glow on the banks of the Nile. The river sparkles in the light, gently brushing against the land along its edge. You stand on this ancient soil, listening to the soft murmur of the river and the distant sound of people going about their daily routines. The towering pyramids and temples in the distance seem to hold the weight of centuries. Yet, beneath the glory of this civilization, as a woman, you understand that your most important role here is that of a mother, a bearer of life. In ancient Egypt, a woman's body was not just her own. It was a tool for the family and society's reproduction. Childbearing was not merely a personal choice, it was the sacred duty of every woman, something that society demanded she fulfill. The social structure in ancient Egypt tightly bound a woman's life to her ability to bear children. A woman's worth was often measured by her capacity to give birth and ensure the continuation of the family. This expectation stripped women of control over their own bodies, turning them into vessels for family and societal reproduction. You walk through the streets and see women with children in their arms, others watching over younger children. There is an obvious love in their eyes, a deep connection to their offspring, but you can also see the faint trace of weariness. The life of a woman in ancient Egypt revolved almost entirely around childbearing and raising children. Their bodies were viewed as tools for reproduction, and their personal desires, dreams, and freedom were quietly silenced by the weight of these responsibilities. In ancient Egypt, the role of women in reproduction was not a choice, it was a societal obligation. Every woman was expected to bear children, especially sons, as they were the ones who would carry on the family name, legacy, and inheritance. This was not merely a natural process but a task that defined the woman's life. The family's survival, social position, and future depended on the women's ability to give birth. You pass by a woman's home, and outside, there is a small garden blooming with colorful flowers. Yet inside, you see her seated, holding a child in her arms. Her eyes reflect not only deep love but a sense of responsibility. This is the reality for women in ancient Egypt. Childbearing and nurturing children were their life's purpose. Their world seemed to revolve entirely around their children, with their health, growth, and future becoming the focal point of their attention. In ancient Egypt, a woman's body was inherently tied to her value in society. A woman's worth was often measured by her ability to bear children, and particularly, sons. The societal expectation was clear: women existed to perpetuate the family's legacy. The more children a woman could produce, the more she fulfilled her societal role. If a woman was unable to bear children or, worse, failed to bear sons, her position in society was often diminished. The ability to bear children was not just seen as a natural process but as a marker of a woman's value in the eyes of society. However, the cost of childbirth in this society was often high. Women's bodies bore the toll of frequent pregnancies and deliveries, each birth taking a physical and emotional toll. Despite the fact that ancient Egypt's social norms never spoke of the pain and sacrifice women endured, it was silently embedded in the lives of every woman. Their bodies, once full of youthful vitality, were worn down by the constant demands of reproduction. Each child born was a blessing for the family, but it also came with great physical cost to the mother. In ancient Egypt, the burden of childbirth was never given the care or attention it deserved. Society demanded that women fulfill their role as bearers of children, yet rarely offered them the support or medical care they needed. Women's health was secondary to their role in childbearing, and once they had fulfilled their purpose, they were often left to suffer silently. Their bodies were constantly under strain, always tasked with bearing more life, even as their own vitality diminished. You stand before an ancient pyramid, a deep thought crossing your mind. Was the grandeur of ancient Egypt built upon these women's silent sacrifices? Their bodies, tasked with the continuation of life, paid a price that was often invisible to the world. Their lives seemed to be solely for the service of others, for the continuation of families and dynasties, until their bodies could no longer bear the weight of reproduction. Yet, even in this land of heavy burdens and limitations, women continued to endure. Though their bodies were not their own, they still carried the weight of society's demands. Their motherhood, their love, and their sacrifice became the pillars of their existence. Even though their bodies were controlled by society's needs, their spirit, their maternal love, was untouchable. On this land, many great women, regardless of their reproductive fate, silently shaped the future of this civilization. The golden glow of the setting sun casts its warm light across the streets of ancient Egypt. You walk along the cobbled roads of the city, the bustling sounds of the market and people's conversations filling the air. The merchants are busy selling their goods, while women walk hurriedly past, their heads lowered and eyes filled with an unspoken weariness. Their steps are quick, yet there is an invisible burden in their hearts, a responsibility that seems to bind them, silently and unyielding. In ancient Egypt, the expectations placed on women by society were unavoidable. These expectations were ingrained in their very being, shaping their roles and responsibilities from the moment they were born. A woman's social position was firmly tied to her family, marriage, and childbearing, and her existence was almost entirely dedicated to meeting the needs of family and society. No matter what personal desires she might have, the responsibilities placed upon her by society were heavy and unchanging. As a mother, wife, and keeper of the household, a woman's main duty was to serve her family and society. She was taught to take on the responsibility of raising children, caring for her husband, and managing domestic affairs. These responsibilities dominated her life. Whether or not she desired more for herself, a woman's life was almost entirely centered around the home. Her freedom and dreams were in constant conflict with the demands of family life. In ancient Egyptian society, women were not afforded the same opportunities for social participation as men. Their primary role was to maintain order in the home, raise children, and support their husbands. Society offered no space for women to develop independently. Instead, their roles were always in service to the men in their lives. A woman's social standing was often measured by how well she performed these familial duties. Whether she could be a good mother, a good wife, and maintain harmony within the family were the criteria for her value in society. Women's social responsibility went beyond the confines of their households. They were expected to uphold the stability and prosperity of their families, ensuring the continuation of their family lines. Their behavior was closely monitored, and any deviation from these traditional expectations was seen as improper and unacceptable. A woman's reputation and social standing were often dependent on her ability to fulfill these roles. You pass by a temple where women are praying devoutly before the gods, their eyes filled with faith and hope. Their prayers may be for their children, or for the future of their families, but you know that their petitions are not merely for personal happiness. Their prayers are for the fulfillment of societal and familial expectations, ensuring that they and their loved ones are recognized and respected by society. Even though they may long for freedom and personal choice, these desires are often buried beneath the weight of family and societal responsibility. In this society, a woman's value was often judged by her role in the family. Her abilities, intelligence, and potential were often overlooked or undervalued. Instead, her worth was measured by her success as a wife, mother, and homemaker. Whether she could ease her husband's burdens or provide nurturing and education for her children, these became the standards by which her value was determined. Her personal growth and self-actualization were often overshadowed by the responsibilities she bore within the family. You stand at a high vantage point, looking out over the city of ancient Egypt. The buildings, temples, and streets paint a picture of an ancient and solemn landscape. Yet behind this picture, the presence of women seems almost hidden. Their lives, you realize, were always closely tied to family and societal needs. They were burdened with immense responsibility, and these responsibilities became their lifelong mission. Even so, women in ancient Egypt found ways to assert themselves within this oppressive social structure. Though they could not escape the roles assigned to them, they wielded immense power within those roles. Through their identities as mothers, wives, and the very backbone of the household, they kept the family and society functioning. Their value may not have been widely recognized, but their contributions were vital to the survival and continuity of Egyptian civilization. You walk through a field where the sunlight filters through the branches above, casting a path of light before you. You know that on this land, though Egyptian women have carried the heavy burden of social responsibility, their perseverance and effort have silently shaped history, leaving an impact on the future. As night falls, the stars gradually dot the ancient Egyptian sky, their soft glow illuminating the vast land below. You stand by the Nile River, feeling the cool breeze on your face as the gentle sound of flowing water fills the air. The surrounding city is quieting down, with only the occasional distant bark of dogs breaking the silence. Yet, on this ancient and mystical land, as a woman, you know that despite the brilliance of its civilization and the long history it has created, this land is not entirely yours. The legal status of women here has long been defined by traditions and culture that have shaped their existence. In the legal system of ancient Egypt, women were generally considered to have a lower status than men. While women's rights were acknowledged in some areas, in most cases, their legal position was subordinate to that of men. Whether it was marriage, inheritance of property, or divorce and remarriage, all decisions were predominantly controlled by men. Women's rights under the law were often granted or permitted by male relatives, rather than being independently held. This reliance on male authority in the legal system placed women in a subordinate position within the social structure of ancient Egypt. Marriage was one of the most prominent manifestations of women's legal status. In ancient Egypt, marriage was almost the ultimate destination for every woman, and their legal position within marriage was entirely dependent on their husband. Women's roles within marriage were almost exclusively focused on managing the household, and their property, inheritance rights, and even their personal freedom were controlled by their husbands. In marriage, women had little power to determine their own fate. Their marriage was arranged by their fathers or families, and once married, their status was entirely subordinated to their husbands. Despite carrying out numerous household responsibilities, women's wealth and rights ultimately belonged to their husbands. The legal system in ancient Egypt also limited women's rights to inherit property. While women could inherit from their fathers or husbands in certain cases, their ability to exercise these inheritance rights was often subject to male relatives' decisions. Many women could not fully control inherited property and might be forced to relinquish part of their rights. Women's wealth and assets were often managed by male relatives, with little to no independent control over their own possessions. Divorce was another area where women's legal rights were severely restricted. In ancient Egypt, the power to divorce was almost entirely in the hands of men. While women could request a divorce in certain circumstances, their choices in this matter were extremely limited. A husband could easily divorce his wife with simple procedures, while the woman needed to petition her husband or the courts. In this patriarchal society, women's positions within marriage were fragile, with their freedom and rights constantly under the control of men. Even women of noble status were not exempt from these limitations in their legal status. While some women from the upper echelons of society might inherit wealth or participate in religious rituals, these rights were always granted with male approval. Women's actions were nearly always subject to their husbands' or fathers' consent. Whether in marriage or the management of property, women could never fully control their own destinies. Their legal status was always bound within the framework of patriarchy, leaving them forever in the shadow of men. However, in ancient Egypt, women still enjoyed some special legal rights. For example, women could be parties in business transactions, participate in commercial activities, and hold important roles in certain religious ceremonies. Their legal status, though limited, allowed them some degree of power and voice. Yet, these rights were still constrained, always requiring male approval and support. Within the legal framework of ancient Egypt, women remained subjugated, their rights and freedoms always subject to male control. You stand by the river, lost in thought. You realize that, while ancient Egypt was a land of great civilization, the legal system here was not equitable for women. A woman's fate was always tied to the power of men. Her body, her wealth, her marriage, and her freedom were always under the control of men. On this ancient soil, women's rights and status seemed forever out of reach, their voices always faint, their contributions often overlooked. And yet, despite these limitations, women in ancient Egypt continued to press forward. They may not have escaped the roles assigned to them, but they still wielded tremendous influence within those roles. Through their identities as mothers, wives, and managers of the household, they maintained the very fabric of the family and society. Their value may not have been widely acknowledged, but their contributions were undeniable in the continuity of Egyptian civilization. As night falls, the golden glow of the setting sun bathes the city of ancient Egypt, casting a warm light on the land. In the distance, the pyramids grow even more majestic under the moonlight, and the surface of the Nile River sparkles faintly. You stand on an ancient stone bridge, gazing into the distance, your thoughts drifting far away. The grandeur and mystery of this civilization have long been celebrated. However, on this ancient soil, the figure of the female leader is often overlooked. Women, though part of Egypt's rich history, seldom receive the honor and respect they deserve in the pages of history. Ancient Egypt, with its grand civilization and rich mythologies, was home to powerful female deities like Isis and Hathor, who symbolized love, motherhood, and wisdom. However, the reality for female leaders in ancient Egypt was very different. While Egyptian society did not explicitly prohibit women from holding political power, their role in the power structure was often minimal. The few women who managed to rise above the gender constraints and take their place on the stage of history, be they queens or priestesses, often saw their power and achievements diminished or erased by history. You walk past an ancient palace, its walls adorned with murals depicting the deeds of many great figures. Yet, the figure of a woman is barely visible. While there were a few legendary female rulers in Egypt, such as Hatshepsut and Cleopatra, their names have often been overshadowed by male-dominated history. During most periods of ancient Egypt, women struggled to break through an invisible ceiling. They not only faced gender discrimination but had to fight against the overwhelming pressure of a patriarchal society. Hatshepsut, one of the most famous women in ancient Egyptian history, rose to become a pharaoh, ruling the nation with authority. Yet, her accomplishments were not universally acknowledged. Despite her reign being one of the most prosperous periods in Egyptian history, many continued to believe that her power was granted through the support of men. Her reign was filled with controversy, and after her death, her name was almost completely erased, with only rare murals and inscriptions revealing her existence. Cleopatra, another prominent female leader, won the hearts and minds of powerful Roman leaders with her intelligence and charm, even becoming the last pharaoh of Egypt. However, her legacy too was overshadowed. Many remember her not for her political brilliance, but for her beauty and the romantic stories surrounding her life. Despite the decline of her rule, Cleopatra became an enduring symbol in history, representing the complex relationships between women in Egypt and the Roman Empire. While these women did leave their mark on history, their achievements were often overshadowed, minimized, or erased. Their power and intelligence were rarely fully recognized. In ancient Egypt, women's leadership existed more in mythology than in the reality of everyday life. While the female deities in Egyptian mythology wielded immense power and wisdom, real women rarely achieved the same respect and authority. Their status was often confined to their domestic roles, unable to break free from the dominance of male power. You enter a temple, where murals on the walls depict scenes from Egyptian mythology, showing powerful female gods like Isis and Hathor. These goddesses held great power, representing maternal strength and divine wisdom. Yet, in reality, women in Egypt rarely attained such respect or power. Their political influence was virtually non-existent, and the societal expectations placed on them ensured they would always remain in the shadow of male authority. Even so, the women of ancient Egypt managed to break through the confines of tradition, carving out spaces for themselves in history. The few who broke through and entered politics, earning respect in society, women like Hatshepsut and Cleopatra, fought long and hard to achieve their positions. Their achievements, though often contested, paved the way for future generations of women. They proved that women were not just the backbone of the home, they could also wield power in the nation and society. You stand on the edge of the ancient desert, looking up at the stars. Your mind drifts, thinking about the hidden voices of Egypt's female leaders. These women may not have changed the world, but their quiet resistance and their presence, though often overlooked, helped shape the future of Egypt. Their strength, though it may not have made waves in the annals of history, still played a pivotal role in shaping the civilization that followed. As night falls, the sacred temples of ancient Egypt grow mysterious and majestic under the dim glow of lamps. You stand at the entrance, gazing at the magnificent structures, hearing the soft chants of the priests echoing through the air. The fragrance of incense fills the temple, and the flickering flames light up every corner of the sacred hall, as if narrating eternal mythologies. As a woman, you understand that while the divine in this land is often represented by male gods, female deities are just as important. The goddesses of mythology hold immense power and wisdom, yet in reality, women struggle to achieve a similar position in the religious structure of ancient Egypt. In the religious system of ancient Egypt, female deities held a significant role. Mythical figures like Isis, the goddess of motherhood, wisdom, and magic, and Hathor, the goddess of love and beauty, represented boundless vitality and sacred knowledge. However, despite the revered status of female deities in myth, women in real life rarely had access to the central positions in religious practices or the power structures associated with them. You enter a temple, where priests are busily preparing for a ritual. The women priests, draped in splendid robes and adorned with crowns symbolizing divinity, move gracefully through the temple, preparing offerings. The scent of incense lingers in the air, and the sound of hymns fills the hollow halls. Yet, you notice that while many women serve as priests, their roles are generally subordinate to the male priests who dominate the core rituals. Although women are allowed to pray and present offerings, they rarely have the authority to lead or decide the course of the religious ceremonies. In ancient Egypt, the core of religious power and the control over rituals were traditionally in the hands of men. While women could participate in religious activities, they typically served as assistants to male priests rather than holding leadership positions. The religious practices, despite their shared participation, were often dominated by men, with female priests seldom taking the lead. Women's roles were seen more in terms of nurturing, homekeeping, and providing blessings for families, rather than holding political or ceremonial power within the temples. Despite this, women in ancient Egypt still played essential roles in religious life. They served as guardians of temples and representatives of the divine, carrying out prayers and rituals on behalf of their families and communities. Though their leadership roles were limited, women priests still held influence within certain ceremonies. Their devotion and wisdom were expressed through rituals, representing the sacred connection between the divine and the family. You observe the women and girls quietly kneeling in prayer inside the temple. Their hands hold incense burners, their eyes lowered in reverence, filled with awe and hope. Their prayers may not be as grand as those of the male priests, but they are filled with love for their families and a deep sense of devotion. While women may not have been able to control the power structures within religion, they still found ways to connect with the divine and express their influence through prayer and ritual. Mythical goddesses like Isis and Hathor symbolized female divinity and strength, and they remain eternal symbols in ancient Egyptian culture. Yet, in reality, women rarely had the same political and religious power. Their roles were often confined to domestic responsibilities, and their status in religious life did not extend to the broader structures of power. The power and reverence given to female deities in mythology were never fully realized in the lives of real women, who were often excluded from positions of authority. Nevertheless, women in ancient Egypt continued to assert their power through faith and devotion. Their worship and participation in religious practices may not have brought them leadership roles, but it provided them with a channel to connect with the divine. Through their prayers, rituals, and offerings, they found their own form of sacred power, offering protection and blessings to their families. Though their divinity was never fully realized in the societal structures of the time, their inner strength and faith were still integral parts of the spiritual life in ancient Egypt. You lower your gaze, feeling the reverent atmosphere within the temple. You realize that while women in ancient Egypt may have been overshadowed by their male counterparts in religious leadership, their devotion and connection to the divine were still undeniable. Their spiritual influence, while not fully recognized, played an essential role in the culture and history of this ancient land. As night falls, the temples of ancient Egypt glow under the soft light of the moon, their majestic forms casting long shadows across the land. You stand by the Nile, watching the river's gentle flow, the surface catching faint ripples under the moonlight. The ancient air carries with it a sense of mystery, and the city is quiet, save for the occasional bark of dogs from distant streets. Yet, in this sacred land, you know that the story of life and death here is not simply an end but a transition, a part of the divine cycle. In ancient Egypt, death was never the final destination, it was simply a step toward immortality. And women, as bearers of life, played an essential role in this process. In ancient Egyptian belief, death was not an end but a passage. Every individual had to undergo the trial of death before they could join the gods in the afterlife. Egyptian religion revolved around the understanding of life and death as cyclical. Death was inevitable, but the soul, after judgment by the gods, would pass into eternal life. In this belief system, the death of women carried a sacred meaning. Women, through their roles as mothers and nurturers of life, were seen as the bridge between the mortal world and the divine, their passage from life to death seen as part of the cosmic order. Yet, for women in ancient Egypt, death was not viewed the same way as it was for men. In the religion of ancient Egypt, women's connection to death was often intertwined with motherhood, fertility, and the mystical forces of creation. Their lives and deaths were seen as key to maintaining the continuity of families and the prosperity of the society. The death of a woman was not just an individual event, it was an important turning point for her family's fate and the spiritual well-being of the community. You walk through an ancient cemetery, where gravestones etch the names and images of those who have passed. Each tomb tells the story of a life, and those stories, though silent, seem to speak of the great cycle of life and death. You stop before the gravestone of a woman, her name and position within the family carved into the stone. Her death marks a critical moment in the life of her family. Her soul is now on its journey to the afterlife, guided by the gods toward eternal life. The stillness of the cemetery speaks to the reverence and sanctity of women's souls, their passage through death toward immortality. In ancient Egypt, the death of women was seen as a transition, not a termination of existence. After death, the woman's soul would join the gods in the afterlife, sharing in the divine immortality. The belief in the afterlife, in which women's souls would be cared for by the gods, provided a spiritual continuation of life, ensuring that death was never truly the end. Through the gods' guidance and offerings from their families, women became part of the cycle of life and death, remaining eternally linked to the divine. However, despite the sacred role women played in these beliefs, their deaths were often not treated the same as men's. While women in religion were honored as divine figures, as mother goddesses or protectors of families, their funerals were often less elaborate, their rites more subdued. Women's tombs, though sacred, were often viewed within the confines of family life, not within the larger social or political sphere. Their passage to the afterlife was crucial, but their memorialization often lacked the same grandeur or recognition granted to men. Still, the women of ancient Egypt, even in death, displayed remarkable resilience. Through their connection to the divine, through their roles as mothers, wives, and nurturers of life, they remained integral to the spiritual and social fabric of Egyptian civilization. Their deaths, while muted by societal constraints, marked the continuation of life through the divine. Their souls, forever in the care of the gods, became part of the eternal flow of the universe, offering protection and blessings for future generations. You sit by the Nile, gazing out at the distant cemetery, feeling the weight of ancient history. The women of Egypt, despite the limitations they faced in life, found their place in the afterlife. Their deaths may have signaled the end of their physical existence, but their souls lived on, woven into the fabric of eternity, serving as protectors and guides for future generations. Every woman's soul in ancient Egypt played a pivotal role in the eternal cycle of life and death, contributing to the continuation of both civilization and spirituality. As the morning sun breaks through the thick clouds, its golden rays illuminate the vast land of ancient Egypt. The waters of the Nile glisten under the morning light, reflecting the golden hues. You stand upon this sacred soil, your gaze stretching across thousands of years of history, feeling as though you can hear the echoes of the past. Ancient Egypt, the cradle of civilization, has witnessed countless monumental events, shaping many great male heroes. But when you look back on this history, can you see the overlooked corners? The women who, though their strength and wisdom once left indelible marks on this land, have since been forgotten by history. In ancient Egypt, the historical legacy of women was often obscured. Though women played vital roles in society, religion, and family, their contributions and achievements were seldom recorded or celebrated. History's pages were typically filled with the names of male rulers, while the names of women quietly faded into the dust. Their wisdom, courage, and accomplishments, which helped shape the grandeur of Egypt, could not escape the constraints of gender and were never fully acknowledged by the annals of history. You walk into an ancient library, where the shelves are lined with scrolls made of papyrus. You flip through one of the ancient texts, its pages filled with stories of Egypt's glorious history and the rise and fall of its dynasties. Each page tells of the deeds of mighty kings, each sentence shining with the glory of their reign. Yet, as you search carefully, the presence of women is nearly invisible. Even the legendary female rulers, like Hatshepsut and Cleopatra, whose names have become points of fascination, do not dominate the narrative in the same way male pharaohs do. Hatshepsut, one of the most famous women in Egyptian history, rose to become a pharaoh and led Egypt to prosperity. Yet, after her death, her name was nearly erased, and her accomplishments were almost entirely forgotten. Despite her reign being considered one of the most prosperous in Egypt's history, many still believed that her power was only granted by the support of male figures. Her legacy, though significant, was overshadowed, as her name and deeds were wiped from most records, leaving only the occasional reference to her in tombs and monuments. Cleopatra, another renowned female leader, used her intelligence and charm to conquer the hearts of powerful Roman leaders, ultimately becoming Egypt's last pharaoh. Yet, like Hatshepsut, her legacy is often reduced to her beauty and her romantic entanglements rather than her political acumen. While she left a powerful mark on history, much of her true political genius was dismissed, and her contributions to Egypt's history were overlooked in favor of personal stories of love and intrigue. In the history of ancient Egypt, although women held crucial roles in religion, politics, and the family, their contributions were often overshadowed by their male counterparts. Many women's names disappeared from historical records, relegated to forgotten spaces. Their stories were not passed down in the same way men's were. Their intelligence and efforts shaped Egyptian civilization, yet they remained largely excluded from the historical narratives that glorified the kings and male rulers. Even though women were pillars of the family and society, their legacies were often buried beneath the weight of patriarchal history. Nevertheless, the women of ancient Egypt continued to contribute their strength to the land, even if their legacies were not immortalized. The women who worked behind the scenes, their wisdom and resilience, shaped countless families and societies. Though their names may not have been remembered, their spirit lived on through their deeds, and their silent contributions were integral to Egypt's prosperity and survival. You stand before an ancient temple, gazing at the mysterious statues and walls carved with hieroglyphs. Every stone, every statue tells the story of a civilization's grandeur, yet hidden behind these glorious tales are the chapters of women's lives that were never written. They may not have been the central figures in history, but their presence is felt in every crack of the ancient land. They are the unsung heroes, an irreplaceable part of ancient Egyptian civilization. You stand at the temple's entrance, a strong emotion rising within you. History may not have written grand chapters for them, but the wisdom, courage, and efforts of these women have left indelible marks on every inch of the land. Their stories may not have been fully told, but their influence is forever etched into the soul of Egypt, passed down through the ages, becoming an inseparable part of the civilization.